Staff Sergeant Isabella Rodriguez was dismissed as nothing more than a cargo loader until enemy missiles started raining down, and she had to grab the controls of a C-17 transport, revealing skills that would shock everyone aboard and expose a military system that had buried one of its most talented pilots. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pre-dawn briefing at Dhafra Air Base felt charged with tension. Staff Sergeant Isabella Rodriguez sat in the third row of the cramped operations center, her cargo manifest clipboard resting on her knee as she watched the flight crew cluster around the coffee station. At 29, she'd mastered the art of invisible competence, staying sharp while appearing unremarkable. In the military, it was often the safest strategy for someone in her position. "Attention on deck!" Captain Marcus Stone's voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade. His imposing frame filled the doorway as he strode to the front of the room, his flight suit crisp despite the early hour. At 38, Stone carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never been told no, his chest decorated with ribbons that proclaimed his importance to anyone within visual range. "Gentlemen," he began, his eyes scanning the room before landing briefly on Isabella with barely concealed dismissal. "And lady," he added with mock courtesy, "we're running a priority cargo mission to forward operating Base Viper, medical supplies, communications equipment, and some classified materials that Uncle Sam needs delivered yesterday." Isabella noticed how he emphasized priority, while his gaze deliberately avoided her section of the room. She'd been assigned as cargo operations specialist, essentially a glorified box counter and weight distribution calculator, according to Stone's condescending briefing the previous evening. The irony wasn't lost on her. She knew more about load distribution and aircraft balance than anyone in the room, but her current assignment meant her expertise was invisible. "Rodriguez," Stone's voice snapped her attention back to the present. "You're here to babysit our cargo. Keep your mouth shut, stay out of our way, and maybe you'll learn something about real flying from professionals." Lieutenant Jake Mitchell, the eager co-pilot fresh from advanced flight training, chuckled. "Don't worry, Sergeant. We'll try not to scare you with any combat maneuvers." His comment drew snickers from the other crew members. Isabella's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but her expression remained neutral. She'd heard worse. What they didn't know, what her personnel file carefully omitted, was that she'd logged over 300 hours piloting C-17s and C-130s in classified combat operations before a bureaucratic nightmare had buried her credentials. Her former commanding officer had promised it was temporary, just until some administrative issues resolved themselves. That was 4 years ago. Technical Sergeant Ryan Walsh, the flight engineer, caught her eye and offered a slight nod. He was older, more experienced, and seemed uncomfortable with Stone's attitude. There was recognition in his glance, the kind that suggested he'd seen enough to know when someone was being underestimated. The fourth crew member, Airman First Class Emma Johnson, barely looked old enough to be in uniform. She clutched her flight checklist like a lifeline and kept stealing glances at Isabella, as if trying to understand why a cargo specialist was generating so much attention from the captain. "Intelligence reports show possible hostile activity in the area," Walsh mentioned, his voice measured. "Might want to consider the high-altitude route through the corridor." Stone waved him off dismissively. "Walsh, I've flown this route 30 times. A little ground chatter never hurt anyone. We stick to the flight plan fast and low. Gets us there quicker." Isabella's pen paused over her manifest. She'd studied the intelligence briefings that morning out of habit, not requirement. The satellite data showed increased enemy movement in the region, including possible surface-to-air missile deployments. She opened her mouth to mention it, then caught Stone's warning glare. "Something to add, Rodriguez?" His tone dripped with condescension. "No, sir. Just reviewing the cargo documentation. Good. That's what you're here for. As the crew filed out toward the flight line, Isabella lingered, studying the intelligence reports left on the table. The threat assessment was worse than Walsh had indicated. Much worse. She pulled out her phone and quietly photographed the data-old habits from her previous life as an actual combat pilot. Outside, the C-17 Globemaster III sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its 4 massive engines gleaming in the pre-dawn light. Isabella had flown birds like this before, knew every system and warning light, every sound the engines made when they were stressed or happy. The aircraft looked pristine, but she noticed small details the others missed. Slight hydraulic staining near the main gear, tire wear patterns that suggested recent hard landings, and a barely perceptible list to starboard that indicated uneven fuel distribution. Walsh was already in the cargo bay, securing the medical equipment. He looked up as she approached. "You ever worked cargo ops before?" "Something like that," she replied, not wanting to lie but unable to tell the whole truth. "You seem to know your way around these birds better than most." Before she could respond, Stone's voice echoed from the cockpit. "Rodriguez, your babysitting station is in the back. Walsh, hurry up with those tie-downs. I want wheels up in 15. Isabella settled into her assigned seat in the cargo bay, strapping in with practiced efficiency. Through the small porthole, she watched the ground crew complete their final checks. Everything looked routine, professional, but something felt wrong. The intelligence reports, Stone's dismissive attitude toward the threats, the crew's inexperience with hostile territory, it all added up to a situation that could go sideways fast. As the engines spooled up, their familiar whine filling the cabin, Mitchell's voice crackled over the intercom. "Hope you're not afraid of flying, Rodriguez. This old bird can get pretty rough in combat zones." Isabella didn't respond. She was too busy listening to the engines, noting the slight irregularity in the number 2 that nobody else seemed to. Here, her fingers drummed against her clipboard, not nervously, but methodically, the way a pianist might practice scales before a performance. The C-17 began its taxi toward the runway, and Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the familiar rhythm of an aircraft coming alive. In a few hours, they'd be at Forward Operating Base Viper, delivering critical supplies to soldiers who needed them. What could go wrong on a routine cargo run? She was about to discover that in hostile territory, nothing was ever routine. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly who need when missiles start flying and everything goes to hell. The flight began smoothly enough. Once they reached cruising altitude over the Persian Gulf, Stone's voice boomed over the intercom with characteristic arrogance. "Beautiful morning for flying, crew. Rodriguez, you getting a good education back there?" Isabella had been methodically checking the cargo restraints, noting how the medical supply containers were secured with standard military precision. But her trained eye caught something the loadmaster had missed. The weight distribution was slightly off. The heaviest container, marked Critical Care Unit, Priority Alpha, was positioned too far aft, which could create stability issues during combat maneuvers. "Copy that, Captain," she replied evenly, her voice betraying nothing of her growing concern. Mitchell laughed over the radio. "She's so formal." "Lighten up, Rodriguez. This isn't a parade ground." What they didn't know was that Isabella was anything but relaxed. Her combat-trained instincts had kicked in the moment they left friendly airspace. She'd been monitoring the aircraft's subtle vibrations, the engine harmonics, the barely perceptible changes in air pressure that indicated they were approaching potentially hostile territory. Details that her current crew either couldn't recognize or chose to ignore. 20 minutes into the flight, the first real warning emerged. Johnson's voice crackled through the intercom, nervous but trying to sound professional. "Captain, I'm picking up some chatter on the emergency frequencies. Sounds like there might be activity in our flight corridor." Stone's response was immediate and dismissive. "Johnson, half the radios in this desert pick up ghost signals. Probably just some camel herders with CB radios. Stay focused on your instruments." But Isabella had been listening too. What Johnson had detected wasn't random chatter, it was the systematic communication pattern of coordinated ground forces. She'd heard it before, in places where that kind of coordination usually meant trouble for aircraft like theirs. Isabella quietly activated her personal radio and tuned to the intelligence frequencies. The traffic she picked up made her blood run cold. Multiple ground units were reporting heavy bird movements in their sector, military speak for large transport aircraft. They were being tracked. "Captain," she called forward, keeping her voice calm. "Request permission to review our flight path data." "Negative, Rodriguez. That's pilot business. You worry about the boxes." But the boxes were exactly what Isabella was worried about. The medical equipment they were carrying wasn't just routine supplies. It was trauma surgery equipment desperately needed by a field hospital that had been overwhelmed by casualties. If they didn't deliver it, soldiers would die. But if they flew into an ambush, everyone would die. Walsh caught her eye and moved closer, speaking quietly. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's wrong?" Isabella hesitated. Sharing tactical concerns wasn't part of her job description as cargo ops, but Walsh seemed like someone who'd listen. "The weight distribution is off, and we're flying into what sounds like a coordinated tracking operation. That's not camel herders on the radio." Walsh's expression grew serious. He'd been in the Air Force long enough to recognize the voice of experience, regardless of someone's official assignment. "You think we're walking into something?" "I think we're flying into something. And when it hits, that medical container is going to become a missile if we have to pull heavy Gs." Walsh glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Isabella. "Stone won't listen to concerns from cargo ops, you know that." "I know that," Isabella replied quietly. "But your flight engineer. Coming from you, it might carry weight." Walsh nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "The container needs to be moved forward by at least 3 positions. And someone needs to convince Stone that we should climb to maximum altitude and take the long route around the activity zone." "You seem to know a lot about combat flying for someone who counts boxes." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "I've counted boxes in a lot of interesting places." Before Walsh could respond, the aircraft's defensive systems panel lit up with amber warnings. Johnson's voice pitched higher with stress. "Captain, we're getting painted by ground radar, multiple sources." Stone's response was immediate and wrong. "Probably just their air traffic control. We're in international airspace." Isabella's hands clenched around her clipboard. She'd been painted by hostile radar before, and this wasn't air traffic control. This was target acquisition radar, the kind that guided surface-to-air missiles. The enemy wasn't just tracking them, they were preparing to shoot them down. "Walsh," she said urgently, "that container needs to be moved now. If we take a hit and have to maneuver hard, it's going to break loose and kill everyone in the cargo bay." Walsh was already moving, but even as he worked to reposition the heavy medical equipment, Isabella could feel the situation deteriorating. The radar painting was getting stronger, more focused. Multiple sites were now tracking their aircraft, with the kind of precision that meant they were well within range of modern surface-to-air missiles. Through the small porthole, she could see the desert landscape passing below, empty, hostile, and offering no emergency landing options for hundreds of miles. If they were forced down, survival would depend on skills that went far beyond cargo operations. Stone's voice crackled through the intercom again, still radiating false confidence. "ETA to Viper is 45 minutes. Weather's clear, systems are green, and we're making good time." Isabella closed her eyes and listened to the aircraft sounds. The engine harmonics were still normal, the structural vibrations within acceptable parameters. But something else was wrong, a subtle electronic whine that suggested their defensive systems were working harder than usual. Someone was actively trying to lock onto them. She pulled out her phone and activated the recording function, speaking barely above a whisper. Flight time 0347 hours. Experiencing multiple ground radar contacts. Probable hostile intent. Aircraft defensive systems engaged. Recommend immediate altitude change and course correction to avoid potential surface-to-air missile engagement. It was the kind of detailed tactical assessment that came from experience that Stone didn't know she possessed. Experience that might be the only thing standing between them and a missile with their names on it. Walsh finished, repositioning the medical container, and returned to his station. He caught Isabella's eye and nodded grimly. The cargo was secure, but they both knew that wouldn't matter if they couldn't avoid what was coming. As the desert landscape continued to scroll past beneath them, Isabella began mentally cataloging emergency procedures, because her growing certainty was that they were flying into an ambush, and when it came, everyone's survival would depend on skills that went far beyond what anyone expected from a cargo loader. The irony was bitter. She had more combat flying experience than the rest of the crew combined, but her current assignment made her invisible. She could only watch and wait as Stone's arrogance led them deeper into danger. But Isabella had learned patience in her previous life. Sometimes you had to wait for the right moment to act. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realized, and when it came, she would be ready. The C-17 droned steadily eastward as they crossed into Iraqi airspace, the massive transport eating up miles at 500 feet per hour. Isabella had settled into a rhythm of monitoring both the cargo and the crew's radio chatter, her ears tuned to frequencies that revealed more than the official communications. Viper Base, this is Cargo Heavy 77. Stone's voice carried his usual confidence as he made the routine check-in call. Ada your location in 32 minutes, requesting updated weather and runway conditions. The response crackled. Back immediately. Cargo Heavy 77 Viper Base. Be advised we've had increased hostile activity in the area. Recommend you consider alternate routing through Corridor Delta 9. Isabella's pulse quickened. Corridor Delta 9 was the high-altitude, roundabout route that added 40 minutes to the flight but avoided known threat areas. It was exactly what she'd been hoping someone would suggest. Stone's response was predictably dismissive. Viper Base, negative on the alternate route. We have priority medical cargo that can't wait. Current routing is acceptable. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Even the base controllers knew Stone was making a dangerous decision, but military hierarchy meant they couldn't override a flight commander's judgment. Mitchell's voice came through the intercom, tinged with uncertainty. Captain, maybe we should consider their recommendation. The medical supplies won't help anyone if we don't make it there. Mitchell, are you questioning my command decisions? Stone's tone had turned sharp, dangerous. I've been flying combat missions since before you learned to tie your boots. We're not running from shadows. Isabella watched this exchange with growing frustration. She'd seen this before, experienced officers whose pride had grown larger than their judgment, making decisions that put everyone at risk. The tragedy was that Stone actually was a competent pilot, but his arrogance had blinded him to the reality of the tactical situation. Walsh moved through the cargo bay, double-checking tie-downs and monitoring the aircraft systems. He paused near Isabella's station, speaking quietly. You were right about the weight distribution. Aircraft's handling much better now. Experience, Isabella replied simply, but her attention was focused on the defensive systems display. She could partially see through the cockpit door. The radar warning receiver was showing more contacts now, a constellation of threats that formed a pattern she recognized from her classified missions. Rodriguez, Stone's voice cut through her concentration. How's our precious cargo doing back there? All containers secure, Captain. Medical equipment is stable and ready for immediate deployment upon arrival. Good, because this is the kind of mission that makes careers. Priority Alpha medical supplies delivered on time despite hostile conditions. The kind of thing that looks good in fitness reports. Isabella almost laughed at the irony. Stone was worried about his fitness report while flying into what was clearly a coordinated ambush. But she kept her expression neutral, playing the role of the competent but unremarkable cargo specialist. Johnson's voice suddenly crackled through the intercom, tight with stress. "Captain, I'm getting multiple radar contacts. They're not responding to IFF interrogation." IFF identification, friend or foe, was the electronic system that let aircraft identify each other as friendly or hostile. When contacts didn't respond to IFF, it usually meant they were either malfunctioning or deliberately avoiding identification. "Johnson, how many contacts?" Stone's voice had lost some of its swagger. 7. No, wait. 9 distinct contacts. They're moving information. Bearing 270. Isabella closed her eyes and visualized the tactical situation. 9 aircraft in formation, approaching from the southwest at their altitude. That wasn't a patrol, it was an intercept formation. Someone was coming to meet them, and it wasn't friendly. "Captain," Walsh's voice was carefully controlled. "Recommend we climb to maximum altitude and increase speed." Negative. "We maintain course and altitude." Could be friendly aircraft on a training mission. Isabella's hands tightened on her clipboard. Training missions didn't fly in formation toward unidentified aircraft in hostile territory. Stone was either incredibly naive or dangerously stubborn. Either way, he was about to get them all killed. She pulled out her phone and quickly sent a text message to a number she'd memorized but never used. C-17 cargo flight. 9 hostile contacts approaching. Commander refusing evasive action. May require emergency assistance. It was a violation of protocol, but Isabella had learned that sometimes protocol was less important than survival. The number belonged to a Special Operations Coordination Center that monitored high-value flights in hostile territory. Mitchell's voice crackled through the intercom again, higher pitched now. "Captain, those contacts are definitely military aircraft. They're flying in attack formation." "Attack formation?" Stone's voice betrayed his first hint of concern. "Johnson, are you sure about that contact count?" "Positive, sir." 9 aircraft closing fast. "And Captain ... they're painting us with fire control radar." Fire control radar was the final step before weapons launch. Someone wasn't just tracking them, they were preparing to shoot them down. Isabella had been painted by fire control radar before, and she knew they had maybe 30 seconds before missiles started flying. "Stone," she called forward, abandoning military protocol in favor of survival instinct. "You need to take evasive action now. This is a coordinated attack." "Rodriguez, shut up and stay in your lane." But Isabella was already moving, unbuckling her harness and heading toward the cockpit. She'd spent too many years in combat zones to sit quietly while pride led them into an ambush. The medical equipment in their cargo bay was desperately needed by wounded soldiers, but it wouldn't help anyone if they were shot down. "Captain," Walsh's voice cut through the tension. "Sergeant Rodriguez has extensive experience with hostile aircraft encounters. Maybe we should listen to her." Stone spun around to glare at Walsh. "Experience? She's a cargo loader." "No," Isabella said quietly, reaching the cockpit door. "I'm a combat pilot with over 300 hours in hostile territory. And right now, I'm the only person on this aircraft who knows how to get us out of this alive." The silence that followed was broken only by the steady drone of the engines and the increasingly urgent beeping of the radar warning system. 9 hostile aircraft were closing fast, and everyone aboard was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person to underestimate is the one who's been underestimated before. Stone's next decision would determine whether they lived to deliver their precious cargo or became another casualty statistic in a war that had already claimed too many lives. The revelation hung in the air like a live wire. Isabella stood in the aircraft's narrow aisle, her stance balanced and confident despite the turbulence of flying at combat altitude, while Stone stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You're lying," he said flatly, his knuckles white on the control yoke. "Check my service record," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Classification code Sierra 7 Alpha. Combat Operations 2019 to 2023. I've got more time in hostile airspace than this entire crew combined. Walsh was already moving toward the cockpit's personnel terminal. In combat situations, crew records were accessible to senior personnel, a safety protocol designed for exactly this kind of emergency. His eyes widened as classified sections of Isabella's file populated on the screen. "Captain," Walsh said quietly, "she's telling the truth. Multiple combat decorations, expert pilot rating on C-17s and C-130s, specialized training in hostile territory operations." Johnson looked back and forth between them, confused and terrified. Then why is she assigned to cargo ops? Because 4 years ago, someone decided that female combat pilots were a political liability, Isabella said without bitterness, simply stating fact. "I was reassigned to support operations while they evaluated unit cohesion impacts. The evaluation never ended." Mitchell's voice crackled through the intercom, tight with panic. "Captain, whatever we're discussing back there, we need to decide now. Those contacts are 2 minutes out and closing fast." Through the cockpit windows, Isabella could see contrails in the distance, thin white lines against the blue sky that marked the approach of aircraft moving at high speed. Her combat-trained eyes automatically began calculating intercept angles, closure rates, and the rapidly shrinking window for evasive action. Stone was frozen, his pride warring with the growing realization that his decisions had put everyone in mortal danger. The radar warning system was now screaming constantly, indicating multiple missile lock-ons from the approaching aircraft. "Captain," Isabella said, her voice cutting through his paralysis, "you have about 90 seconds to decide whether your ego is worth more than the lives of everyone on this aircraft." "I don't take orders from cargo loaders," Stone snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Isabella stepped closer to the cockpit, her military bearing unmistakable now. "Then don't think of me as a cargo loader. Think of me as the only person on this aircraft who survived a missile attack before." Walsh made the decision for all of them. "Isabella," he said, using her first name for the first time, "what do you need?" "Access to the defensive systems and permission to take evasive action. We're not outrunning 9 fighters, but we might be able to outmaneuver them long enough to reach friendly airspace." Stone's face went purple. "You can't just—" "I can and I will," Isabella interrupted, already moving toward the pilot station. "Mitchell, I need you to transfer defensive systems control to the backup station, now." "I can't do that without the captain's authorization," Mitchell replied, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. "Then get it," Isabella said simply, her hands already hovering over the backup controls. "Because in about 60 seconds, those fighters are going to be in missile range. And when they fire, someone needs to be ready to keep us alive." The aircraft's threat warning system suddenly erupted in a cacophony of alarms. Multiple missile launches had been detected, their heat signatures painting bright red tracks on the defensive display. Isabella's blood ran cold as she counted them. 6 missiles, all targeted at their aircraft. Missiles in the air. Johnson screamed over the intercom. Multiple launches bearing 270. Isabella didn't wait for permission. She lunged forward and grabbed the backup flight controls, her muscle memory from hundreds of combat hours taking over. The C-17 responded immediately to her input, dropping altitude and banking hard to the right as the first missile streaked past their position. "What the hell are you doing?" Stone shouted, fighting for control of the aircraft. "Saving our lives," Isabella replied through gritted teeth, pulling the massive transport through a series of evasive maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and crew to their limits. "Those missiles are heat seekers. We need to get low and fast, use the terrain to break their lock." The second missile exploded close enough to rock the aircraft, sending everyone not strapped and tumbling across the cabin. Isabella felt the familiar rush of combat flying, the hyper-awareness, the split-second decisions, the dance with death that separated great pilots from good ones. "This is insane," Mitchell muttered, but his voice held admiration rather than fear. "This is combat flying," Isabella corrected, banking the aircraft so hard that the structural stress alarms began sounding. "What we were doing before was just flying straight into an ambush." Walsh was monitoring the defensive systems, his face grim. "4 more missiles tracking us. These guys are serious about shooting us down." Isabella's mind raced through the tactical options. The C-17 was a transport. Not a fighter, it was built for carrying cargo, not dogfighting. But she'd learned in her previous life that any aircraft could be defensive if the pilot knew how to use the terrain, the weather, and the enemy's expectations against them. "There," she pointed to a valley system ahead of them. "We go low, use the mountains to break their radar lock. These fighters are fast, but they're not built for low-altitude maneuvering in rough terrain." Stone was staring at her with something approaching awe. "You're actually doing this. You're outflying military fighters in a cargo plane." "I'm not outflying them," Isabella replied, threading the C-17 between 2 mountain peaks with precision that defied the aircraft's size. "I'm outthinking them. They expected us to run straight and level. Instead, we're doing what transport pilots aren't supposed to do." The third missile detonated against a mountain peak, its explosion lighting up the valley behind them. Isabella felt a grim satisfaction. The enemy pilots were good, but they were flying by the book. She was flying by survival instinct honed in places where the book got you killed. "Viper Base, this is Cargo Heavy 77, she called into the radio, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We are under attack by multiple hostile aircraft, requesting immediate fighter support and emergency landing clearance." The response came back immediately. "Cargo Heavy 77, we show you as off course and below minimum safe altitude. What is your situation?" Isabella banked hard to avoid another missile, the G-forces pressing everyone into their seats. "Our situation is that we're being shot at by 9 fighters, and we're about to find out if a cargo plane can dogfight long enough to deliver critical medical supplies." As the 4th missile exploded harmlessly behind them, Isabella realized that everything was about to change. Word would spread quickly through the military about the female cargo loader who'd taken control of a C-17 under fire. There would be questions, investigations, and career ramifications for everyone involved. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, there was only the aircraft, the missiles, and the desperate need to stay alive long enough to deliver supplies that could save lives on the ground. The C-17 screamed through the mountain valley at an altitude that would have terrified seasoned combat pilots. Isabella kept the massive transport mere hundreds of feet above the rocky terrain, using every ridge and canyon to break the enemy's missile locks. The aircraft's proximity warning system was screaming constantly, but she'd learned to tune out everything except the essential information her survival depended on. "Missile lock broken," Walsh reported, his voice tight with stress as he monitored the defensive systems. "But they're repositioning for another attack run." Isabella banked the aircraft hard to the left, following a narrow canyon that twisted between towering peaks. The C-17's wings cleared the rock walls by margins that would have been impossible to calculate. She was flying by instinct now, trusting skills honed in combat zones where hesitation meant death. "This is impossible," Mitchell breathed, watching the canyon walls flash past the cockpit windows. No one flies a C-17 like this. Isabella does, Walsh replied grimly. And it's the only reason we're still alive. Through the intercom, they could hear Johnson's panicked breathing. The young airman was strapped into her seat in the cargo bay, watching medical equipment worth millions of dollars strain against tie-downs that were never designed for this kind of maneuvering. "Captain Stone," Isabella called over the roar of engines and wind, "I need you to take over communications. Contact every friendly unit in the area and tell them we have priority medical cargo that absolutely must reach Viper Base." Stone, who had been silent since Isabella took control, finally found his voice. "Why should I help you?" "Because those medical supplies include a portable surgery unit that's the only thing standing between a field hospital and a mass casualty event," Isabella replied, pulling the aircraft into a climbing turn that used a thermal updraft to gain altitude while staying hidden behind a mountain peak. "And because despite what you think of me, I'm not doing this for my career. I'm doing it to save lives." The truth was that Isabella had read the classified medical reports that morning. Forward Operating Base Viper had been hit by a coordinated attack that overwhelmed their trauma capabilities. Without the advanced surgical equipment they were carrying, doctors would be forced to make impossible choices about which wounded soldiers to treat first. "Viper Base, this is Captain Stone." Stone's voice crackled over the radio, his tone subdued. "Be advised, Cargo Heavy 77 is continuing mission despite hostile contact. We are carrying priority Alpha medical supplies including the portable surgery unit requested for mass casualty operations." The response came back immediately. "Cargo Heavy 77, understood. Be advised we have friendly fighters en route to your position. ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Isabella calculated rapidly. The enemy fighters were faster and more maneuverable, but they were also burning fuel at a prodigious rate, trying to keep up with her low-altitude evasion tactics. If she could keep them in the mountains for another 12 minutes, help would arrive. "Isabella," Walsh's voice was urgent. "I'm showing engine temperature spikes on number 3. The stress is taking its toll." Isabella glanced at the engine instrumentation. The Pratt & Whitney turbofans were running hot, pushed beyond their normal operating parameters by the constant high-G maneuvering, but they were still within acceptable limits barely. "We can nurse it along," she replied, banking into another Valley system. "These engines are tougher than they look." The fifth missile of the engagement streaked past the aircraft, its proximity fuse detonating close enough to pepper the C-17's fuselage with shrapnel. Warning lights began flashing across the instrument panel as systems reported damage. "We're hurt," Mitchell reported, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems showing faults." Isabella felt the aircraft's response change subtly. The controls were heavier now, requiring more input to achieve the same maneuvers. But the C-17 was still flying, still responding to her commands. She'd flown damaged aircraft before, and this one still had fight left in it. "Johnson," Isabella called to the cargo bay. "How are the medical supplies?" "Secure, but barely," Johnson replied, her voice shaky. "The surgery unit is straining against the tie-downs. If we pull many more Gs, it's going to break loose." Isabella nodded grimly. The portable surgery unit was the most critical piece of equipment they were carrying, a complete operating theater that could be set up in minutes to handle trauma cases. If it broke free and was damaged, soldiers would die. "Walsh, I need you to get back there and personally secure that surgery unit. Use whatever you can find, cargo straps, rope, anything." "On it," Walsh replied, already moving toward the cargo bay. The sixth missile came closer than any before, its warhead detonating just below the aircraft's belly. The explosion lifted the C-17 like a giant hand, throwing everyone against their restraints. Isabella fought the controls as the aircraft bucked and rolled, its damaged system struggling to maintain stability. "We're losing altitude," Mitchell reported, his voice tight with concern. "Controlled descent," Isabella corrected, though she knew they were in serious trouble. The aircraft was injured, running on damaged systems, and she was running out of mountain terrain to hide behind. The enemy fighters were still out there, repositioning for what would likely be their final attack. "Isabella," Stone's voice was quiet, almost contemplative. "I owe you an apology, and probably my life." "Save the apologies until we're on the ground," Isabella replied, scanning the horizon for any sign of friendly aircraft. "We're not out of this yet." As if summoned by her words, Walsh's voice crackled through the intercom. "Multiple aircraft. Bearing 090, closing fast." "They're not squawking friendly IFF." Isabella's heart sank. More enemy fighters, approaching from a different direction. She'd evaded the first group, but now they were being bracketed by multiple attack formations. The mathematics of survival were getting increasingly desperate. "How many?" she asked, already calculating evasion routes. Double quotes. 4. No 6 contacts. "They're coming in low and fast." Isabella looked at the fuel gauges, the engine temperature readings, the growing list of system failures. The C-17 had given everything it had, but physics was an unforgiving opponent. They were running out of options, running out of time, and running out of luck. But she'd learned something in her years of combat flying. When you're out of options, you create new ones. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what your enemy doesn't expect. "Everybody hold on," Isabella said quietly. "We're about to find out if a cargo plane can dogfight with the best of them." The moment of truth came when the new wave of enemy fighters closed to within visual range. Isabella could see them now, sleek, deadly aircraft designed for one purpose: destroying targets like hers. But as she watched their approach pattern, she noticed something that gave her hope. "They're flying textbook intercept formations," she said, more to herself than to the crew. "Predictable, professional, but not creative." Stone, who had been watching Isabella's flying with growing amazement, finally understood what she was seeing. "You're going to use their training against them." "Exactly." Isabella's hands moved over the controls with surgical precision. "They expect a cargo plane to run straight and level, maybe attempt some basic evasive maneuvers. They're not prepared for someone who's willing to break every rule in the book." The first pair of fighters came in high and fast, their missiles already locked on the C-17's heat signature. Isabella waited until the last possible second, then executed a maneuver that should have been impossible for an aircraft of the C-17's size and weight. She rolled the massive transport, inverted, and pulled it into a dive that used the mountain's thermal currents to accelerate beyond the aircraft's normal operating speeds. The pursuing missiles, designed to track aircraft flying predictable patterns, lost their lock and detonated harmlessly against the mountainside. "Jesus Christ," Mitchell breathed, watching the world spin outside the cockpit windows. "How are you doing that?" "Practice," Isabella replied grimly, rolling the aircraft back to level flight mere feet above a rocky plateau. "And desperation." But the maneuver had cost them. The aircraft's stressed engines were running dangerously hot, and the damaged hydraulic systems were struggling to keep up with the demands Isabella was placing on them. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree, each one representing a system pushed beyond its design limits. "Isabella," Walsh's voice came from the cargo bay, tight with concern. "The medical equipment is taking a beating. If we keep pulling G's like this, we're going to lose the surgery unit." Isabella's jaw clenched. The portable surgery unit was the whole reason for this mission. Without it, the field hospital at Viper Base would be unable to handle the casualties from the recent attack. But if she flew straight and level to protect the equipment, the enemy fighters would shoot them down, and the medical supplies would help no one. "How much more can it take?" she asked. Maybe one more high-G maneuver. After that, the tie-downs are going to fail. The second pair of fighters was approaching now, having learned from their comrades' failure. They were coming in lower, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last second. Isabella could see their strategy. They were trying to force her into a predictable evasion pattern that would bring her into the sights of the remaining fighters. "Stone," she called over the intercom, "I need you to take over communications. Tell Viper Base we're going to need medical teams on the runway. If we make it, we're going to be coming in hot and damaged." "If we make it?" Stone's voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been there before. "The aircraft is hurt, and we're running out of fuel and altitude. This next maneuver is going to determine whether we live or die." Johnson's voice crackled through the intercom, steadier now than it had been earlier. "What do you need us to do?" Isabella felt a surge of pride in her crew. They were scared, anyone would be, but they were. Still functioning, still supporting the mission. "Just hold on and trust me. We're going to do something that violates every principle of safe flying." The enemy fighters were closing fast, their missiles armed and ready. Isabella could see the lead pilot's helmet through his canopy. He was young, probably not much older than Johnson, flying with the precision of someone who'd trained for this exact scenario. "Here we go," Isabella muttered, and pulled the C-17 into a maneuver that should have torn the aircraft apart. She used the mountain's wind shear to create a controlled stall, allowing the massive transport to drop like a stone while the enemy missiles passed overhead. Then, just as the aircraft was about to hit the ground, she recovered control and pulled out of the dive, using the ground effect to gain speed while staying below the fighter's minimum engagement altitude. The maneuver worked. The missiles missed, and the fighters overshot their target. But the cost was immediate and severe. The No. 3 engine began spewing black smoke, its temperature gauges redlining as internal components failed under the stress. "Engine failure on No. 3, Mitchell reported, his voice professionally calm despite the circumstances. "Shutting down and securing." Isabella nodded grimly. The C-17 could fly on 3 engines, but their performance margins were now razor thin. Any more damage and they'd be flying a controlled crash rather than an aircraft. "Viper Base, this is Cargo Heavy 77. Stone's voice crackled over the radio. "We have sustained battle damage and are declaring an emergency. Request immediate landing clearance and emergency services." The response came back immediately. "Cargo Heavy 77, cleared for emergency landing runway 09. Emergency services are standing by." Isabella could see the base now, a cluster of buildings and runways carved into the desert landscape. It looked impossibly small from their altitude, but it represented safety, medical care for their wounded, aircraft, and most importantly, the chance to deliver the medical supplies that could save lives. 2 minutes out, she called to the crew. "Walsh, how's that surgery unit? Hanging by a thread, but still secure. The tie-downs are stretched to their limits. Johnson, prepare for emergency landing procedures. Stone, Mitchell, I need you both on the controls for this approach. The aircraft is going to be a handful with only 3 engines." As they lined up for final approach, Isabella realized that everything was about to change. Word would spread quickly through the military about the female cargo loader, who'd outflown enemy fighters and delivered critical medical supplies under fire. There would be investigations, media attention, and career consequences for everyone involved. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, there was only the runway ahead, the damaged aircraft beneath her hands, and the knowledge that she'd proven something important, not just to her crew, but to herself. Sometimes the most dangerous person to underestimate is the one who spent years being underestimated. The approach to Viper Base was unlike anything Isabella had ever attempted. The C-17 was limping through the sky on 3 engines, its hydraulic systems compromised, and its electrical systems throwing warnings faster than the crew could acknowledge them. But Isabella had learned something crucial in her years of combat flying. Sometimes the most dangerous situations require the calmest responses. "Gear down," she called, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Gear down and—" "Locked." Mitchell responded, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Hydraulic pressure is marginal. We might not have brakes on landing." "We'll deal with that when we get there," Isabella replied, adjusting the approach angle to compensate for the asymmetric thrust from the failed engine. "Stone, I need you to coordinate with the tower. Tell them we're going to need the entire runway and emergency foam if they have it." Stone keyed the radio without hesitation. "Viper Tower, Cargo Heavy 77 on final approach. We have battle damage, single engine failure, and compromised hydraulics. Request full emergency services and runway foam." The response was immediate. "Cargo Heavy 77, emergency services are in position. Runway is clear, winds are calm, you are cleared to land." Through the cockpit windows, Isabella could see the base personnel gathering along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency crews were positioned at strategic points, ready to respond if the landing went wrong. But what caught her attention was the cluster of officers near the control tower, more brass than she'd ever seen assembled for a single aircraft arrival. "Word travels fast," Walsh observed, following her gaze. "Looks like we're going to have company when we shut down." Isabella nodded grimly. A cargo loader taking control of a military transport under enemy fire was the kind of incident that would generate reports all the way to the Pentagon. But that was a problem for later. Right now, her only concern was bringing the aircraft down safely. "Flaps to landing configuration," she called. "Flaps set," Mitchell responded, his hand steady on the controls despite the stress of the situation. "Approach looks good, considering." The C-17 descended through the last 1,000 feet of altitude, its remaining engines straining to maintain proper approach speed. Isabella could feel the aircraft's reluctance. It was tired, damaged, and ready to be on the ground. But it was still flying, still responding to her commands. 500 feet, Mitchell called out. "Looking good." The runway rose to meet them, a ribbon of concrete that represented safety and the successful completion of their mission. Isabella's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision, making minute adjustments to compensate for the aircraft's damaged systems. 200 feet, 150. The C-17 touched down with a solid thump that spoke of a successful landing, despite the challenging circumstances. Isabella immediately deployed the thrust reversers on the working engines and began applying what little brake pressure the damaged hydraulics could provide. "We're down," she announced, her voice carrying relief she didn't try to hide. "Welcome to Viper Base, everyone." The aircraft rolled to a stop well short of the runway's end, its engines winding down with the satisfied sound of machinery that had performed beyond its design limits. As the noise faded, Isabella could hear the approaching sirens of emergency vehicles and the distinctive sound of military boots on tarmac. "Hell of a piece of flying," Stone said quietly, and Isabella was surprised to hear genuine respect in his voice. "I've never seen anyone handle a damaged aircraft like that." "Experience," Isabella replied simply, but she allowed herself a small smile. "And a little luck." The cargo ramp was lowering even before the engines had fully spooled down. Isabella could see medical personnel rushing toward the aircraft, their faces tense with the knowledge that lives depended on the equipment they were carrying. "Walsh, how's our precious cargo?" Isabella called. "Surgery unit is intact," Walsh reported, grinning broadly. "Banged up but functional. The doctors are going to have their operating theater after all." Johnson unbuckled her harness with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. "Ma'am, I've never experienced anything like that." "You saved all our lives." Isabella was about to respond when the first of the base personnel appeared in the cargo bay. Colonel Victoria Hayes, the base commander, was a compact woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Behind her came Major Nathan Cross, the operations officer, and Captain Lisa Park from Flight Safety. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Colonel Hayes's voice was carefully neutral. I understand you took control of this aircraft during the flight. Yes, ma'am. When hostile aircraft began engaging us, I assumed control to execute evasive maneuvers. And you're qualified on this aircraft? Yes, ma'am. Though my current assignment doesn't reflect my flight ratings. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly. Major Cross, I want Sergeant Rodriguez's complete service record pulled immediately. Captain Park, you'll be conducting a full investigation of this incident. Stone stepped forward, his posture rigidly military. Colonel Hayes, ma'am, I take full responsibility for Captain Stone. The colonel's voice cut through his statement like a blade. You'll have plenty of opportunity to explain your actions during the investigation. Right now, I'm more interested in understanding how a cargo operations specialist managed to outfly enemy fighters and deliver critical medical supplies under fire. Isabella felt the weight of everyone's attention on her. This was the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating for 4 years, the moment when her buried credentials would finally come to light. Colonel, she said simply, I'm not just a cargo operations specialist. I'm a combat pilot who was reassigned due to administrative decisions that had nothing to do with my flying abilities. The silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of medical equipment being unloaded and the distant whine of jet engines as friendly fighters finally arrived to secure the airspace. Colonel Hayes studied Isabella for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Sergeant Rodriguez, effective immediately, you're relieved of cargo operations duties. Major Cross will escort you to debriefing, and then we're going to have a very long conversation about your career. Isabella nodded, understanding that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But as she watched the medical personnel rush the surgery unit toward the field hospital, she knew that whatever came next, she'd made the right choice. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly who need when everything goes sideways. The debriefing room at Viper Base was sterile and windowless, designed to focus attention on the matter at hand rather than the world outside. Isabella sat across from Colonel Hayes, Major Cross, and Captain Park, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the magnitude of what was unfolding around her. Let's start from the beginning, Colonel Hayes said, activating a digital recorder. When did you first realize Captain Stone was making decisions that endangered the mission? Isabella considered her words carefully. Military debriefings were legal proceedings, and everything she said would become part of the official record. Ma'am, I became concerned when Captain Stone dismissed intelligence reports about hostile activity and refused to consider alternate routing recommended by both ground control and his own crew. Major Cross leaned forward, consulting his tablet. According to the flight data recorder, you initiated evasive maneuvers without authorization from the aircraft commander. That's a serious violation of military protocol. Yes, sir. But the alternative was allowing 9 hostile aircraft to shoot us down while carrying critical medical supplies that soldiers needed to survive. Captain Park had been silent throughout the initial questioning, but now she spoke up. Sergeant Rodriguez, your service record shows extensive gaps in your flight experience. Can you explain the discrepancy between your current assignment and your apparent flying abilities? Isabella had been dreading this question, but she'd also been preparing for it for 4 years. Ma'am, my flight experience includes classified operations that aren't reflected in my standard personnel file. I was reassigned to logistics support in 2020 following what was described as an administrative restructuring. Colonel Hayes's expression sharpened. What kind of classified operations? Combat airlift missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Special operations support, medical evacuation under fire, and supply runs to forward operating bases in contested territory. I logged over 300 hours in hostile airspace before my reassignment. Major Cross was already typing on his tablet, accessing the classified portions of Isabella's file. His eyebrows rose as the data populated. Colonel, her record shows multiple combat decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross for a medical evacuation mission under enemy fire. Then why? Captain Park asked. Are you currently assigned to cargo operations? Isabella's jaw tightened slightly. Because in 2020, Major William Harrison filed a complaint alleging that female pilots were a distraction in combat zones. He recommended that all female aviators be reassigned to support roles, pending a comprehensive review of unit effectiveness. The silence that followed was thick with understanding. All three officers had been in the military long enough to recognize the political maneuvering that had buried Isabella's career. Major Harrison, Colonel Hayes said quietly, was Captain Stone's mentor and former commanding officer. Yes, ma'am. The review he recommended was never completed, but the reassignments were never reversed. A knock on the door interrupted the debriefing. A young lieutenant entered, his face flushed with urgency. Colonel Hayes, ma'am, sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this. He handed the colonel a tablet displaying a news feed. The headline read, Female Sergeant Saves Transport Aircraft from Missile Attack, Exclusive Combat Footage. How did this get out? Colonel Hayes asked sharply. Ma'am, apparently one of the crew members was recording video during the engagement. The footage shows Sergeant Rodriguez's evasive maneuvers and the missile attacks. It's gone viral on social media. Isabella felt her stomach drop. Media attention was the last thing she wanted. But as she watched the colonel's expression, she realized that public scrutiny might actually work in her favor. There's more, ma'am, the lieutenant continued. The medical team at the field hospital has reported that the surgery unit delivered by Sergeant Rodriguez's flight has already saved 3 lives. The doctors are calling it a miracle that the equipment arrived intact despite the battle damage. Colonel Hayes set down the tablet and looked directly at Isabella. Sergeant Rodriguez, it appears that your actions today have saved not only your crew, but also the lives of wounded soldiers who needed that medical equipment. That's going to complicate any disciplinary action we might have considered. Ma'am, I didn't do this for recognition or to avoid discipline. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I believe you, Colonel Hayes replied. But the reality is that this incident has attracted attention from levels of command that go well beyond this base. The Secretary of Defense has already requested a full report. Major Cross cleared his throat. Colonel, there's another issue. Captain Stone has formally requested that all charges against Sergeant Rodriguez be dropped. He submitted a written statement taking full responsibility for the tactical errors that led to the engagement. Isabella was surprised by this development. Stone had been humiliated by her actions, but apparently he was still enough of an officer to recognize the truth when he saw it. What about the crew? Isabella asked. Mitchell, Walsh, and Johnson, they supported me when it mattered most. They've all submitted statements praising your actions, Captain Park replied. Technical Sergeant Walsh, in particular, has recommended you for the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism. The Air Force Cross was the service's second highest decoration, awarded for exceptional acts of courage in combat. Isabella had never imagined that her actions would be considered worthy of such recognition. There's something else, Colonel Hayes said, consulting another document. The Pentagon has requested that you report to Washington for a special assignment review. Apparently, your unconventional flying techniques have caught the attention of some very senior people. Isabella felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. A special assignment review could mean anything from a promotion to a transfer to a completely different career path. Colonel, what about my current assignment? Will I be returning to cargo operations? Colonel Hayes actually smiled at that question. Sergeant Rodriguez, I think it's safe to say that your days of counting boxes are over. The question now is whether you want to return to active flight status, or if you're interested in something even more challenging. More challenging than outflying enemy fighters in a cargo plane. Much more challenging. The kind of flying that pushes the boundaries of what's possible with current aircraft and technology. Isabella felt her pulse quicken. She'd spent 4 years buried in a job that didn't challenge her abilities. The prospect of flying assignments that would test her skills to their limits was exactly what she'd been hoping for. When do I report? To Washington? She asked. Next week. In the meantime, you'll be staying here as our guest while the investigation is completed. And Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Hayes's voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the debriefing. Congratulations on a job well done. As Isabella left the debriefing room, she realized that her life had changed. Completely in the span of a few hours. The viral video, the media attention, the Pentagon's interest, it was overwhelming. But it also represented the vindication she'd been seeking for 4 years. Sometimes the most important battles are fought, not by the people everyone expects to be heroes, but by the people everyone forgets are there at all. The investigation that followed Isabella's heroic flight took 3 intensive weeks. 3 weeks of interviews, testimony, and bureaucratic maneuvering that reached from Forward Operating Base Viper all the way to the Pentagon. Isabella found herself at the center of a storm that had less to do with aviation and more to do with the military's ongoing struggle with institutional bias and the recognition of excellence regardless of gender. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Technical Sergeant Ryan Walsh had requested a formal meeting with the investigating team, arriving with a manila folder thick with documents and a determination that surprised everyone present. Colonel Hayes, Walsh began, his weathered face set in serious lines. I've been in the Air Force for 18 years, and I've flown with a lot of pilots. What Sergeant Rodriguez did wasn't just good flying, it was exceptional flying under impossible circumstances. Major Cross leaned forward, intrigued. Can you be more specific, Sergeant Walsh? Yes, sir. I've documented every aspect of the engagement. Walsh opened his folder, revealing detailed notes, photographs, and technical analyses. The evasive maneuvers Sergeant Rodriguez executed should have been impossible for a C-17. The G-forces alone should have caused structural failure. Captain Park studied the documentation with growing amazement. How did you gather all this data? I've been keeping detailed flight logs for 20 years, ma'am. It's a habit from my early days as a crew chief. But this flight was different. I knew we were witnessing something extraordinary, so I documented everything. Walsh pulled out a series of photographs showing the aircraft's battle damage. 6 missile near misses, direct hits from shrapnel, and engine failure. By all rights, we should have been shot down. But Sergeant Rodriguez kept us flying through tactical maneuvers that I've never seen attempted in a transport aircraft. The investigating team exchanged glances. Walsh's testimony was providing technical validation for what had seemed like an impossible story. There's more, Walsh continued. I've been researching Sergeant Rodriguez's background, and the pattern of her reassignment matches similar cases of female pilots being moved to support roles under questionable circumstances. Colonel Hayes looked up sharply. What kind of pattern? Between 2019 and 2021, 12 female pilots with exceptional combat records were reassigned to logistics or support roles. All of them had received complaints from a single officer, Major William Harrison. All of them had their reassignments processed through the same administrative review board. The implications were staggering. It wasn't just Isabella who had been affected, it was a systematic effort to remove female pilots from combat roles. Do you have documentation of this pattern? Major Cross asked. Walsh nodded grimly. service records, reassignment orders, and complaint filings. I've been a crew chief long enough to recognize when good pilots are being wasted. What happened to Sergeant Rodriguez was just the most visible example. The second major development came from the crew's testimony. Lieutenant Jake Mitchell had requested to testify on Isabella's behalf, and his statement was compelling in its honesty. "Sirs, ma'am," Mitchell addressed the panel, "I need to be clear about something. When Captain Stone was making decisions that endangered our mission, I was too junior and too scared to speak up. Sergeant Rodriguez wasn't. She saw the tactical situation clearly and acted to save our lives. Can you elaborate on Captain Stone's decision-making?" Captain Park asked. Mitchell's jaw tightened. He ignored intelligence reports about hostile activity, dismissed recommendations from both ground control and his own crew, and refused to consider alternate routing that would have avoided the engagement entirely. And when the missile attack began, Captain Stone froze, ma'am. He was a competent pilot in normal conditions, but he wasn't prepared for combat against multiple fighters. Sergeant Rodriguez took control because if she hadn't, we'd all be dead. The third witness was Airman First Class Emma Johnson, whose testimony proved unexpectedly powerful. Despite her youth and relative inexperience, she had observed the entire engagement with the clear eyes of someone who understood exactly how close they had come to disaster. "Ma'am," Johnson addressed Colonel Hayes directly, "I've been in cargo operations for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone handle equipment under stress like Sergeant Rodriguez did. She knew exactly how to secure the medical supplies for high-G maneuvers, exactly how to distribute weight to maintain aircraft stability, and exactly how to coordinate with the flight crew under fire. Those are advanced skills for someone assigned to basic cargo operations," Major Cross observed. "Yes, sir. That's what made me realize she wasn't just a cargo specialist. She was a pilot who had been assigned to the wrong job." The most damaging testimony came from Captain Marcus Stone himself. In a closed-door session, he provided a brutally honest assessment of his own failures and Isabella's heroism. "I let my pride nearly get everyone killed," Stone admitted, his voice hollow with regret. "I ignored intelligence reports, dismissed crew concerns, and refused to take evasive action when we came under attack. If Sergeant Rodriguez hadn't taken control, we would have been shot down. Why didn't you listen to her warnings?" Colonel Hayes asked, Stone's face flushed with shame. "Because I couldn't accept that a female cargo specialist knew more about combat flying than I did. My ego was more important to me than the lives of my crew. And now? Now I know that Sergeant Rodriguez is one of the most skilled pilots I've ever encountered. She deserves to be flying combat missions, not counting boxes in a cargo bay." The investigation's most significant finding came when Captain Park accessed the classified portions of Isabella's service record. What she found there changed everything. "Colonel," Park reported, "Sergeant Rodriguez's actual flight experience includes 347 hours of combat flying, including 23 missions in contested airspace. She has commendations for aircrew excellence, combat effectiveness, and superior performance under fire." Then why was she reassigned to cargo operations? Because Major Harrison filed a complaint alleging that her presence was detrimental to unit morale and combat effectiveness. The complaint was later substantiated by testimony from officers who had never flown with her. Colonel Hayes's expression darkened. "Testimony from officers who had never flown with her?" "Yes, ma'am. The entire reassignment was based on secondhand opinions and prejudicial assumptions, rather than actual performance evaluations. The pattern was becoming clear. Isabella hadn't been reassigned because of any failure in her performance. She'd been reassigned because of systematic bias that had buried one of the Air Force's most talented pilots in a job that wasted her abilities." "What's the current status of Major Harrison?" Colonel Hayes asked. "He was promoted to lieutenant colonel last year, ma'am." He's currently stationed at the Pentagon, serving as a special advisor on personnel assignments. The irony was bitter. The officer who had destroyed Isabella's career had been rewarded with promotion and increased authority over personnel decisions. "That's about to change," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "I'm recommending a full investigation into Major Harrison's role in these reassignments. And I'm recommending that Sergeant Rodriguez be immediately restored to flight status with a promotion to reflect her actual experience and capabilities." As the investigation concluded, Isabella realized that her heroic flight had accomplished something far more important than delivering medical supplies. It had exposed a system that had been systematically discriminating against female pilots and had created an opportunity for meaningful change. The most rewarding moment came when she received a letter from the field hospital at Viper Base. The portable surgery unit she had delivered had been used to save 7 lives in its first week of operation. 7 soldiers who would go home to their families because she had refused to let pride and prejudice prevent her from doing what she knew was right, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The formal ceremony at the Pentagon was unlike anything Isabella had ever experienced. The ornate briefing room was filled with senior officers, media representatives, and officials from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. At the center of it all sat Isabella, wearing her dress blues with ribbons that finally reflected her actual service record. Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams stood at the podium, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Today, we gather to address a serious failure in our personnel system and to recognize extraordinary heroism that might have gone unnoticed if not for the courage of one individual." Isabella felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a forgotten cargo specialist. Now she was at the center of a military scandal that had reached the highest levels of government. The investigation into the events of Flight Heavy 77 has revealed systematic discrimination that affected dozens of qualified female pilots. Secretary Williams continued. This discrimination was not accidental. It was deliberate, organized, and carried out by officers who placed personal bias above military effectiveness. In the audience, Isabella spotted Colonel Hayes, who had flown in from Viper Base specifically for the ceremony. Next to her sat Walsh, Mitchell, and Johnson, her crew, who had testified so powerfly on her behalf. Even Captain Stone was present, though he sat in the back row, his face a mask of shame and regret. Lieutenant Colonel William Harrison has been relieved of duty and is facing court-martial proceedings for abuse of authority and discrimination, Secretary Williams announced. His actions buried the careers of 12 exceptional pilots, including Staff Sergeant Isabella Rodriguez. Isabella felt a surge of satisfaction at this news. Harrison's career was over, but more importantly, the systematic discrimination he had orchestrated was being exposed and dismantled. The investigation also revealed that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez possesses one of the most impressive combat flying records in the Air Force, the Secretary continued. Her classified missions included 347 hours of combat flying, 23 missions in contested airspace, and multiple commendations for exceptional performance under fire. Major Cross stepped forward, carrying a leather folder containing Isabella's new assignment orders. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, by order of the Secretary of Defense, you are hereby promoted to the rank of Technical Sergeant and reassigned to active flight status with the 41st Test Squadron at Edwards Air Force Base. The Test Squadron. Isabella's heart raced. Edwards Air Force Base was home to the Air Force's most advanced experimental aircraft programs. It was where the boundaries of flight were pushed beyond what anyone thought possible. Furthermore, Secretary Williams continued, you are awarded the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire, and the Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional piloting skill under combat conditions. The Air Force Cross. was the service's second highest decoration, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Isabella had never imagined that her actions would be considered worthy of such recognition, as the medals were pinned to her uniform. Isabella thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 4 years of being underestimated, dismissed, and buried in a job that didn't challenge her abilities. But those 4 years had also taught her patience, resilience, and the importance of doing what was right regardless of personal cost. After the ceremony, Isabella was approached by Dr. Amanda Foster, a civilian aerospace engineer who had been watching the proceedings with obvious interest. "Technical Sergeant Rodriguez," Dr. Foster said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Foster from the Advanced Aircraft Development Program. I've been following your case with great interest." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm honored by the recognition, but I was just doing my job." Dr. Foster smiled. "That's exactly the attitude we need in our program. We're developing aircraft that push the boundaries of what's possible, experimental designs that require pilots who can think beyond conventional limitations." Isabella felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of aircraft?" "Hypersonic transports, adaptive wing designs, and autonomous flight systems that still require human oversight. The kind of flying that requires not just skill, but the ability to adapt to situations that have never been encountered before." It was exactly the kind of challenge Isabella had been hoping for. After 4 years of being underestimated, she was being offered the chance to work at the cutting edge of aviation technology. "There's one more thing," Dr. Foster continued. "Your unconventional flying techniques during the missile attack have caught the attention of some people at NASA. They're developing a new program for civilian test pilots, and they're looking for aviators who can handle impossible situations." Isabella's mind raced. NASA. The possibility of pushing the boundaries of flight beyond Earth's atmosphere was something she'd never dared to dream about. "When would I start?" Isabella asked. "The Edwards assignment begins next month. The NASA program is still in development, but they've specifically requested that you be considered for the selection process." As the reception continued around them, Isabella was approached by her former crew members. Walsh was grinning broadly, Mitchell looked proud, and Johnson seemed awestruck by the surroundings. "We wanted to thank you," Walsh said simply. "Not just for saving our lives, but for showing us what real leadership looks like." "You supported me when it mattered most," Isabella replied. "That kind of trust is what made everything possible." Mitchell stepped forward. "Ma'am, I've requested a transfer to Edwards. I want to learn from the best, and that's you." Isabella was touched by the gesture. Mitchell had grown tremendously during their crisis, and she'd be honored to continue working with him. "What about you, Johnson?" Isabella asked the young airman. "I'm applying for pilot training, ma'am. If someone with your background can be buried in cargo operations, I want to make sure I'm prepared for anything." Isabella smiled. Johnson had learned an important lesson about the military, that talent and dedication didn't always guarantee recognition, but they were still worth pursuing. As the evening wound down, Isabella found herself standing alone on the Pentagon's observation deck, looking out at the lights of Washington. 3 weeks ago, she had been a forgotten cargo specialist. Tonight, she was a decorated hero with opportunities that exceeded her wildest dreams. But the most satisfying part wasn't the recognition or the medals. It was the knowledge that her actions had exposed a system that had been systematically discriminating against qualified female pilots. The investigation had led to policy changes that would ensure future generations of women would be judged on their abilities rather than their gender. Isabella pulled out her phone and read a text message that had arrived during the ceremony. It was from the field hospital at Viper Base. "Surgery unit has now saved 15 lives. Thank you for making sure we got the equipment we needed." 15 lives. 15 soldiers who would go home to their families because she had refused to let pride and prejudice prevent her from doing what she knew was right. As she prepared to leave the Pentagon, Isabella realized that her story was far from over. The Edwards assignment would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new chances to push the boundaries of what was possible. But she'd learned something important during those dark years of being underestimated. Sometimes, the most powerful position is the one nobody sees coming. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly who you need when everything is on the line. The future stretched ahead of her, full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. And for the first time in 4 years, Isabella Rodriguez was exactly where she belonged. 2 years later, the experimental aircraft hangar at Edwards Air Force Base hummed with activity as Isabella completed her pre-flight inspection of the X-47C. Aurora, a hypersonic transport prototype that existed at the very edge of aerospace technology. The sleek, angular aircraft looked more like a spacecraft than a traditional airplane. Its adaptive wing surfaces and revolutionary propulsion system representing the future of high-speed flight. All systems green, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez called out Chief Master Sergeant David Chun, the test flight engineer who had become Isabella's trusted partner in pushing the boundaries of experimental aviation. Weather conditions are optimal for the hypersonic evaluation flight. Copy that, Chief, Isabella replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. Initiating startup sequence. As she climbed into the cockpit of the Aurora, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The test pilot program at Edwards had challenged every aspect of her flying skills, requiring her to master aircraft that operated on principles that barely existed when she first learned to fly. Her radio crackled. To life. Aurora 1, this is Control. You're cleared for takeoff when ready. Aurora 1 copy, rolling now. The prototype lifted off with an otherworldly smoothness, its revolutionary engines propelling it into the desert sky at speeds that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. As Isabella climbed through 50,000 feet, she thought about the letter she'd received that morning, a letter that would change her life once again. Control, Aurora 1 is airborne and climbing. All systems nominal, she reported, her hands moving over controls that represented the cutting edge of aerospace technology. Copy, Aurora 1. Take her through the evaluation sequence at your discretion. As Isabella began putting the experimental aircraft through its paces, she recalled the conversation she'd had with Dr. Foster the previous week. NASA's Mars aviation program was finally ready to select its first crew of civilian test pilots, aviators who would be responsible for developing and testing aircraft designed to fly in the thin atmosphere of Mars. The program is unlike anything we've ever attempted, Dr. Foster had explained. We need pilots who can adapt to conditions that have never been experienced, who can think beyond conventional limitations, and who can maintain peak performance under pressures that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. Isabella had known immediately that she wanted to be part of that program. After 2 years of testing experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of Earth-based flight, the prospect of pioneering aviation on another planet was irresistible. Control, Aurora 1 is initiating hypersonic acceleration, Isabella reported as the aircraft's speed climbed past Mach 5. Systems are performing within expected parameters. The Aurora responded to her commands with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. Isabella had learned to trust these experimental aircraft, to understand their capabilities and limitations in ways that went beyond technical specifications. It was a skill that had been honed through years of being underestimated, years of proving herself in situations where failure wasn't an option. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Congratulations, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez. You have been selected for the NASA Mars Aviation Program. Report to Houston next month for advanced training. Isabella smiled as she read the message. The selection process had been grueling: psychological evaluations, physical testing, and technical assessments that challenged every aspect of her abilities. But she'd made it through, just as she'd made it through the discrimination that had tried to bury her career. "Control, Aurora 1 is completing the evaluation sequence," she reported. Returning to base. As the experimental aircraft descended toward Edwards, Isabella could see the sprawling test facilities that had become her second home. But she knew that her time here was coming to an end. The Mars program would take her to Houston, then to specialized training facilities around the world, and eventually to the Red Planet itself. "Outstanding flight, Technical Sergeant," Chief Chun's voice crackled through the radio. "The Aurora performed flawlessly." "She's a remarkable aircraft," Isabella replied, guiding the prototype toward a perfect landing. "Almost like she was designed for conditions we haven't encountered yet." As the Aurora touched down and rolled to a stop, Isabella was met by a familiar figure, Lieutenant Jake Mitchell, now a captain and one of Edwards' most promising test pilots. He'd followed Isabella to the experimental program and had become one of her most trusted colleagues. "How did she handle?" Mitchell asked as Isabella completed her post-flight procedures. "Like a dream," Isabella replied. "But this might be one of my last flights in her." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "NASA, Mars Aviation Program." "I got the call this morning," Mitchell grinned broadly. "Congratulations, you're going to be flying on another planet." "That's incredible." Isabella nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. "It's surreal. 4 years ago, I was counting boxes in a cargo bay, dismissed as nothing more than a logistics specialist. Now I'm going to be pioneering aviation on Mars." "You earned it," Mitchell said simply. "Every bit of recognition, every opportunity, you earned it by never giving up, even when the system tried to bury you." As they walked toward the debriefing facility, Isabella reflected on the impact her story had had beyond her own career. The investigation that followed her heroic flight had led to significant policy changes throughout the military. The systematic discrimination that had affected her and 11 other female pilots had been exposed and dismantled. More importantly, her story had inspired a new generation of female aviators who no longer had to worry about being buried in support roles because of their gender. The military's aviation programs were now truly merit-based, judged on skill and performance rather than prejudice and politics. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source, Captain Marcus Stone, who had quietly rebuilt his career after the investigation. "Saw the news about NASA. Congratulations, you deserve every bit of success coming your way." Isabella smiled at the message. Stone had learned from his mistakes and had become an advocate for merit-based assignments and equal opportunity in aviation. Their relationship would never be close, but there was mutual respect now. That evening, Isabella sat in her quarters writing her acceptance letter to NASA. On her desk lay several items that had become her most treasured possessions: the Air Force Cross and Distinguished Flying Cross she'd received at the Pentagon, a photograph of her crew from the day of their heroic flight, and a recent letter from the field hospital at Viper Base. The letter contained remarkable news. The portable surgery unit she'd delivered had now been used to save 43 lives. 43 soldiers who had gone home to their families because she had refused to let pride and prejudice prevent her from doing what she knew was right. But the most meaningful item on her desk was a handwritten note from a young girl named Sofia Martinez, the daughter of one of the soldiers whose life had been saved by the surgery unit. The note was simple but profound. "Thank you for bringing the doctors what they needed to save my daddy. When I grow up, I want to be a pilot like you." Isabella sealed her acceptance letter and looked out her window at the star-filled desert sky. Somewhere up there, Mars waited a world where atmospheric conditions would make Earth's most challenging flying seem routine. where the margin for error would be measured in the survival of humanity's first interplanetary aviators. It was exactly the kind of impossible challenge that Isabella Rodriguez had been born to meet. Her story wasn't about proving she belonged in a man's world. It was about proving that excellence belonged to anyone willing to develop it, regardless of what others expected. And now that excellence was going to take her farther than anyone had ever imagined possible. From a forgotten cargo specialist to a pioneering aviator on another planet, Isabella's journey proved that sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody sees coming. The girl everyone underestimated was about to make history among the stars. 3 years later, from the Houston Chronicle Science section, NASA announces first successful Mars aircraft flight. Isabella Rodriguez pilots historic mission on Red Planet, Houston. NASA announced today that Technical Sergeant Isabella Rodriguez successfully piloted the first powered aircraft flight on Mars, marking a historic milestone in human space exploration. Rodriguez, 34, commanded the Mars Atmospheric Research Vehicle, MARV, during a 45-minute flight that established the first aerial transportation network on another planet. Isabella represents everything we need in a Mars aviator, said Dr. Amanda Foster, director of the Mars Aviation Program. She has demonstrated the ability to adapt to impossible conditions and make life or death decisions under pressures that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. The MARV program launched as part of the Mars Colony initiative in 2027. Rodriguez and her crew established aerial supply routes that support scientific research and colony development across the Martian surface. When asked about her journey from cargo specialist to Mars pilot, Rodriguez was characteristically modest. The most important lesson I've learned is that excellence isn't about where you start. It's about refusing to let others define your limits. Rodriguez credits her former Air Force crewmaster Sergeant Ryan Walsh, Major Jake Mitchell, and Senior Master Sergeant Emma Johnson with supporting her during the career transformation that launched her path to Mars. They believed in my abilities when it mattered most, Rodriguez said. That kind of trust changes everything. The Mars aviation team is already planning expanded operations, including cargo flights to support the growing Mars colony and exploration missions to previously inaccessible regions of the planet. For a woman who was once dismissed as just a cargo loader, Isabella Rodriguez has literally reached new heights, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the most ordinary circumstances. Her story continues to inspire aviators around the world, particularly women entering aviation careers. As Rodriguez often says, the strongest person in the room is often the one no one saw coming. If you found Isabella's incredible journey inspiring, remember that courage comes in many forms, and sometimes the most important stands we take are the ones nobody expects. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.